Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Kuneva Walker with the Provincetown Film Society. It seems like lifetimes away when we held our first summit in Provincetown, Massachusetts 5 years ago. Then we wanted to get everyone off their phones so that we could concentrate on these most important issues. And now, thanks to our phones, we're all here. Through those years, I've been so grateful for Dr. Heldman's friendship and commitment, the work of the Representation Project and that collaboration. And I'm thankful for the involvement of our newest collaborators at the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment. As for our esteemed colleagues, I'm so grateful to you for your work and for giving us the benefit of your incredible knowledge. I know that we'll learn a lot from you. So thank you so much for being here. Caroline.
Thank you. It is fantastic to be launching our 5th State of the Media Summit. As Christine noted, this started way back when we were called the Women's Media Summit, and then realized, wait a minute, if we're pushing for diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to push for that for all underrepresented and marginalized groups in media. So we have broadened it to the State of Media Summit, and the purpose of this summit is to bring everybody together into this space and talk about what progress we've made. And we're doing that through data. And then to provide recommendations for how we move forward. So a couple of housekeeping things. The first is closed captioning is enabled. So please turn that on at the bottom of your screen. It says live transcript. So turn that on if you would like. The second is we're going to have a Q&A at the end. It'll last about 10 minutes. So please put your questions throughout the panel and the conversation in the Q&A. And the third housekeeping is that we want to incorporate your recommendations for how these various media industries need to change, what's effective, what you have seen work. Please, throughout this program, put your comments in the chat. Everyone will, at the end of this presentation, you will receive the deck, the data that we're using, but you will also next week receive the report, which incorporates all of the ideas from this panel, as well as your ideas from the chat, curated in an organized fashion. So please view this as a participatory Zoom. I know we're all a little zoomed out, but engage with the panel through the chat function. And now I'll turn it over to Monica, our partner at CME.
Thanks, Caroline. So yes, I work with Dr. Nicole Haggard and Joy Donnell at the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment, also known as CME. Our mission is to advance intersectional representation in media and entertainment, and we do so by bringing together what we call the 5 A's: artists, activists, audiences, academics, and allies in the industry, because by embracing these different perspectives, we can find new interdisciplinary methods to promote inclusive representation. And that we do all this because we believe that representative narratives can positively impact culture and generate more profits, which are the 2 things that we are most focused on doing and very excited about.
And it is an honor to work with you, Monica, and the folks over at CME and the Provincetown Film Society. At the Representation Project, we use film education, research, and social activism in order to fight sexism and shift gender norms and stereotypes. And I want to share my screen, first off, to show you some fantastic graphics that our graphic designer put together for the State of Media Summit for Equity and Inclusion. But secondly, here is a keynote address from Jennifer Siebel Newsome, who is the founder of the Representation Project, as well as our Chief Creative Officer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Siebel Newsome, the founder and Chief Creative Officer of the Representation Project, and I'm honored to have been invited to speak to you at this 5th annual State of the Media Summit. It's heartening and encouraging to see so many talented people gathered in one place who understand both the profound power of the media to shape our lives and the urgency to change the destructive ways that it shapes us. It's already been a decade since we premiered our first documentary, Misrepresentation. The film ignited a national conversation about how girls and women are both dangerously misrepresented and underrepresented in media and our larger culture. But as I traveled the world discussing the film and seeing its impact, I was struck by the constant questions and concerns about the way our media negatively impacts boys and men. And it was those conversations that led us to make the documentary, The Mask You Live In, which sparked another national conversation, this time about the causes and consequences of toxic masculinity. As we've done our work, I've been continuously lifted up and inspired by the tireless work of so many of you here at this event who have dedicated your lives to taking on these same issues. Working together, we have made progress. We have. Still, as we all know, we have a long way to go. We've raised awareness, that's important, but that is only half the battle. The other half is making real the measurable change in media content. And that is what this State of Media Summit is all about. So as we set our sights on the obstacles we still have to overcome, I think it's important to take a moment to celebrate some of our victories. This year at the Academy Awards, Zhao became the first woman of color to win for Best Director, and she won for a film that featured the life of an older adult woman. We saw Emerald Fennell win for Best Original Screenplay for a script centered on a woman's life. And Mia Neal and Jamaica Wilson were the first Black women to win an Oscar for Best Makeup and Hairstyling. And so this is what progress looks like. And we should all be applauding ourselves for how we contributed to that. But of course, we're gathered together today because our work is not nearly done. Our media still reflects dangerous cultural norms and stereotypes. It promotes toxic masculinity for boys, causes body hatred and shame in girls, and self-hatred in gender nonconforming youth. We need more and better representations of women, especially women of color, queer women, fat women, and women of all body sizes, women with disabilities, and older women. And as Emma Lazarus put it, until we are all free, none of us are free. So I'm committed to this marathon push for intersectional gender justice in media and our larger culture, and I look forward to working with you every step of the way. Onwards and upwards, and have a great summit. Good afternoon.
All right, so I am just in terms of the agenda today, I'm gonna take 5 minutes to take you through a blast of data because we want to benchmark what has happened in the past 10 years and where we are now in terms of different measures and different identities. Don't worry, don't bother to take notes and don't worry about the speed. You're going to receive a copy of this PowerPoint after this, right after we're done with the summit. You'll receive this and then the bigger report next week. But I want to just reiterate our 3 sponsors of the event today. And in terms of what we're looking at, we are looking at representations in film, television, advertising, video games, and music. And the identities that we are measuring here, pulling together research from all these different organizations, are representations of gender, race, age, disability, body size, and sexuality. In terms of the sources, we are pulling data from UCLA on the Hollywood Diversity Report, of course, the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, Martha Lausen's work down at SDSU, the Writers Guild of America West, GLAAD, the Representation Project, and the Directors Guild of America. So let's jump right in. Let's look at the current state of representation, both on the screen and behind the scenes when it comes to film. First, when it comes to the female characters in the top films from 2010 to 2020, we find that male characters outnumber women characters 2 to 1, and that this hasn't improved in the last decade. Thankfully for BIPOC characters, we actually see an improvement starting in 2018 for characters of color and their representation, although they remain underrepresented. So you'll notice there's a baseline 39.9%. We're comparing all of these to the US population in order to measure both progress, how much remains, but also to measure progress over time. LGBTQ plus characters make up 4.5% of the US population. And you can see that while we have made progress starting really in 2018, in 2020, we see some spikes there, still vastly underrepresented when it comes to the characters in the top films. Same with disabilities. And when we think about disability, we're really thinking about and measuring physical disability, communication disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and mental health disabilities. 26% of the US population has a disability, and yet vastly underrepresented. In fact, you could say that, I mean, this is a virtual erasure, right? Under 5%. In terms of characters who are ages 50 plus in the top films, we find that although 1 in 3 Americans is ages 50 plus, that they are underrepresented and have remained underrepresented for the past decade in the top films. When it comes to fat characters, 42.5% of the US population would be considered a large body type, so vast underrepresentation there. And I should note that the Representation Project is one of the organizations that is fighting to reclaim the term fat. We do not think it is an insult. We actually think that reclaiming that word and renaming, so really reframing the meaning of that word will allow us to better fight fat phobia and fat hatred. So just a point on the use of language there. But again, to reiterate, vast underrepresentation of fat folks in the top films. When it comes to behind the scenes, you see the same major gaps. So some progress, but major gaps between where women are in the population and where they are as directors. Same with BIPOC film directors, and while progress does appear to be increasing since 2018, it is still a vast underrepresentation for folks of color as film directors. We see the same pattern with women screenwriters. So some improvement, 2018, 2019, and 2020, we see a positive trajectory upwards, but still fewer than half of what the representation is in the broader population. The same with BIPOC screenwriters, the same with female film producers. You'll notice that it is a better rate than directors and writers, so a higher number, but still an underrepresentation in the population and very little movement in the past decade. When it comes to the state of television, we see much of the same, although higher rates of representation across the board. So you see, we haven't made much progress in the past decades, still underrepresented, but less of a gap than in film. When it comes to BIPOC characters in the top TV shows, we actually find that in the past couple of years, we've almost or actually achieved representation compared to the broader population. And for LGBTQ plus characters, the story here is very positive in TV. We have achieved representation for LGBTQ plus characters in the top TV shows. We have not seen the same success for characters with disabilities. And in fact, it has stayed stagnant and virtually erased for the past decade. When it comes to older characters, we don't see progress. Over the past 10 years, it goes up and down and still underrepresented. Same with fat characters, a pretty vast underrepresentation of characters with large body types in the top TV shows. And then when it comes to behind the scenes on TV, we see an underrepresentation of women show creators. We see an underrepresentation of BIPOC TV show creators. We also see an underrepresentation when it comes to directors, the same pattern, although some progress in recent years. We see some progress in recent years for BIPOC TV show creators, but still an underrepresentation. Now I'm starting to sound like a broken record. We see some progress in the last couple of years when it comes to women writers, the same with BIPOC writers, but still we have work to do. When it comes to advertising, we find that male characters outnumber girls and women as characters. Almost 2 to 1. It's a little less than the ratio is not quite that bad, but it's remained stagnant for the past decade. For BIPOC characters, the news is better. We've seen some steady improvements, 2017, 2018, a dip in 2019, but around representation compared to the broader culture. And in terms of LGBTQ plus characters and advertising, remember 4.5% in the US population, 1.8% in ads, so an underrepresentation, a vast underrepresentation when it comes to characters with disabilities in ads. Remember, it's 26% of the US population compared to 2% of the one study that we have for ads in 2019. Underrepresentation for characters ages 50 plus, same thing for fat characters. When it comes to video games, we only have 2 studies that have been published, one in the US in 2006 and one in the UK in 2017. And what you see is a vast underrepresentation of women video game characters. BIPOC video game characters hasn't improved, and a vast underrepresentation. When it comes to music, we see the same story. It's about, women are half the population, but only 1 in 5 of the top Billboard musical artists. BIPOC musical artists, the story is positive. We have seen progress over time, and the numbers match those or exceed those in the population. We see a vast underrepresentation when it comes to women songwriters, and female music producers are virtually erased. This is a huge hole in the industry. And I am going to end it at that. That is your data dump for the day. And now we are going to get to our incredible panel. And again, please put your comments in the chat. I want to introduce to you Joy, who is the chief visionary of Superjoy Media and co-founder of the luxury lifestyle platform Venice. In 2008, she co-founded See along with other colleagues on this call. So Joy, it is yours.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And thank you for all of that data. I was seeing in the chat that was really emboldening people and enlivening them to start to really understand the landscape. So we have an amazing panel for you all today. And I'm just going to go ahead and quickly introduce everyone so that we can get to the insights. So we have Lauren Applebaum, who is VP Communications at the Disability Advancement Nonprofit Respectability. We have Dr. Ninoshka McTaggart, Dr. Nosh, Associate Vice President of Research and Insights at the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. Rebecca Cooper, who is a researcher and impact data manager at the Representation Project. And one of my partners in crime, Dr. Nicole Haggard, who is co-founder of CME, the Center for Intersectional Media Entertainment, and a professor in the Film, Media, and Social Justice Department at Mount St. Mary's University. Hey, everyone.
Hi, Joy.
Thank you for joining us today. So, let's just go ahead and get into it. And Lauren, I'm gonna pop a question over to you.
Sure.
Okay, so, your organization, Respectability, is doing so much to advocate for better representation for people with disabilities in media. But as we just saw with those numbers, I mean, there's still a long way to go. People with disabilities are vastly underrepresented in every kind of way you can think about, all major forms of media content. So beyond that, my question is about what happens when they do appear on screen. Like, when we're actually seeing people with disabilities represented, are these tropes and stereotypes that we're seeing in media, or are we seeing authentic representation?
Unfortunately, goes to the kind of what you said before, the tropes and the inauthentic representation. And I saw someone ask the question about children's TV as well. So when we're talking about disability, as we saw in the presentation, 3.5% of characters on screen in kind of primetime TV, and less than 1% in children's TV. And so, especially in children's TV, we are erased. And you can't see my disability. I have something called reflex sympathetic dystrophy. It damaged my sympathetic nervous system in my right arm and right leg. And that kind of plays into another thing of, do we have to visibly see a disability in order for it to count as a disability? So let's get into some of these tropes that we see a lot. Oftentimes characters are dehumanizing disabled individuals, harmful stereotypes, and there are more, but I'm just going to give you kind of the top line of a few. Include a villain, which basically uses the physical feature of a disability to make a person appear evil, causing people to be afraid of those who are different from them. The victim, which defines a character solely by their disability and often glorifies suicide as a better option than living with an acquired disability. Myself, my disability is an acquired disability and has the nickname of the suicide disease because it causes chronic pain. And so I'm very, very sensitive personally to that trope. Another one is the innocent fool, which portrays characters with developmental or intellectual disabilities as unable or unworthy of making rational decisions for themselves. And the supercrip, which reinforces this idea that disability is something that has to be overcome. I want to briefly also touch on the models of how we look at disability, because I think that plays a huge part. There's something called the charity model that says people with disabilities need to be taken care of. The medical model states that disabled people need to be cured. Instead, we strive for the social model, which says that society is what needs to be changed to be accessible for those of us with disabilities. And I think it's really important as well to recognize that disability cuts across every single demographic. Almost every good representation we see is of a straight, white, cis male in a wheelchair. It's slowly changing, but people of all different races, genders, sexual orientations, et cetera, have disabilities or can be born with a disability, can acquire a disability. And then to kind of think about the diversity of disability. People who are deaf or blind have a cognitive disability like Down syndrome, non-visible disability like a learning disability or mental health condition. And lastly, disability is one of the areas where casting has really yet to see major issues with hiring non-disabled actors to play a disabled role. You're seeing it, thank goodness, less and less where someone is hired to play a different race than themselves, but it should be considered the same thing with disability. A disability is a lived experience. You can't teach that. And so the data mentioned here was of disabled characters, not actors, mainly because a lot of that data doesn't exist yet. So it's important to look at who's playing these roles, as well as how we talked about the tropes about how disabled folks are represented.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And, as we're talking about the way that the human experience expresses in the body, right, and how that is shown on screen, my next question is for Nosh, like Dr. McTaggart. Dr. McTaggart, I love just saying doctor in front of people's names. Dr. McTaggart, we know your academic research is really focused on intersectional race representations, right? But there's a trope conversation within that too. And you recently co-authored the Black Women in Hollywood report for the Gina Davis Institute. So talk to us for a second about how Black women and other women of color are represented in media. Like, what are the patterns that you're seeing in terms of tropes and stereotypes and the same old thing that probably just needs to be balled up and thrown into the trash and set on fire that we're seeing in relation to these characters?
Yeah, so I just wanted to show, to follow up on the comments we just heard. There are also tropes and stereotypes we're seeing in the, as far as representation of Black women go. So I just wanted to maybe start with like an evolution of historical stereotypes and tropes that we see for Black women. So we've seen the mammy trope, which came out of slavery, and it's the idea that Black women are caretakers. They're kind of at the service of their white masters, taking care of their children, not taking care of themselves. We have the Jezebel, which is more of the sexual temptress. And then we have like a sapphire trope, which is a woman who is hot-headed, easy to react, fiery. So those have evolved into the strong Black woman trope, the angry Black woman trope, the welfare queen / baby mama trope. And then also we see this continuing thread of hypersexualization when we see representations of Black women. So I would just argue that the stereotypes we've seen historically have just transformed and evolved, but a lot of the foundation and roots of those historical stereotypes still remain today. As far as prominence goes, we see that only 3.7% of leads in the last decade have been Black female characters. So that's far underrepresenting the number of Black women and girls that we see in society. We also looked at colorism and hair types in this study, which I thought was very interesting areas to focus on. So as far as skin tone goes, we see less than 20%, about 19% of leads have dark skin tones. So this isn't surprising because we know colorism is an issue, maybe not often talked about or not talked about as much as we should, but we did find that over time. And as far as hairstyles go, we also see, not surprisingly, a trend of more straight hairstyles, extensions, wigs, so a preference over natural hairstyles for Black women who are represented in media. So I just wanted to maybe quickly go over some of the other patterns we see of representation. So we do see some promising things. I want to emphasize that. So we do see Black female characters being shown as leaders at similar rates as their white female counterparts, which is promising. We also see, as far as women, Black women in STEM jobs, we also see an equal level of their white counterparts as well there. And then being shown as smart. Actually, in our research, we found that Black female characters actually were more likely to be shown as smart as their white female counterparts and other female characters of color. So on to the more negative findings that we found, we do see that Black women are less likely to be shown as having an occupation than their white female counterparts. We also see them as shown as more violent. So going with this whole angry Black woman trope, the idea that Black women are violent or angry and willing to lash out. And then we also see the sexualization or hypersexualization, which has been a stereotype that we've seen time and time again. So Black women are more likely to be shown as hypersexual than their white and women of color counterparts there. So overall, I would say just the idea that, Black women are still underrepresented generally, and we still see some of these trends that we've seen over decades and centuries of Black women being shown as angry, hypersexual, and also, caretakers as well. So we really have to look at intersectional identities. That's another thing we're focusing on. So not only race, but how that intersects with ability, sexual orientation, body size, age. All of those things are really, really important. So looking at the quality of the representation and not just the quantity, I would say is going to push that needle forward.
Oh, thank you for sharing that quality versus quantity. Like, that's such a key thing to really drilling down and seeing what's happening in between the layers, even of what is positive progress and then what is still taking forever to lag along. I mean, I've always personally had an issue with the strong Black woman trope. That always sounds like an order from Black & Decker for me instead of an actual human being. And two, as you were saying, there's also the layers of everything else, sexual orientation and size and everything else. And so with that in mind, Rebecca, I'd love to ask you a question about what you're doing with the Representation Project, because we know that your research is focusing on those many different identities and their intersections as well. And there's the body size representation focus that you have been looking at. So what have you found when it comes to representations of fatness on screen? And why is body size diversity so important in media in the first place? Why are we having this conversation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the presentation that Caroline did, to see that over 42% of the US population is fat or has large body types, it's just so astounding, the gap between the reality and then actually what we see represented in media. First of all, there's just not that much data out there about fatness representation. And it's new, more folks, more orgs, as we saw in the State of Media report, are starting to include fatness, fat phobia, and different body sizes in their reports, which is awesome. One thing we found that I think is striking is, and this is the same for all identities, but especially with representations of fatness, we see fat phobia and fat slurs pop up even when there are no fat characters. So you have shows in films where fat characters are completely erased, but still they are the butt of jokes over and over again. Fat insults are used to put down thin characters. And there are also moments that embody fat stereotypes and tropes that have absolutely nothing to do with the plotline. So that's something that comes up a lot. Another thing that's striking to me is there's almost no good examples of fat lead characters. There are really, really good examples, but still they're not devoid of tropes and stereotypes. One that I like to call out is Suki, who is one of my favorite characters from Gilmore Girls. I grew up watching her. She is she is an awesome fat woman. She's empowered. And at first, she's the first person that comes to mind when I think of a character that has positive representations for the fat community. But then when you really think about it, she plays sidekick to Lorelai. She's clumsy and klutzy in the kitchen. And in the kitchen, her entire life revolves around food and making food and how good food tastes as a chef. And it's not that her character is awful or hard to watch, but it's just, again, we see the same tropes and stereotypes pop up across the board. And another thing that's interesting is the ways, and again, this is what Dr. Nanoshka and Lauren both said too, but the ways that intersectionality really plays into the world of fatness representation is important, because we see different tropes and stereotypes pop up for fat women than fat men, for disabled fat people, obviously for fat women of color and fat BIPOC characters too, like Nanoshka brought up. There's all sorts of different tropes and stereotypes that are hard to measure because there just aren't that many representations out there yet. So I'm hoping that the more we push for fat inclusivity and different body sizes to be portrayed in better ways, that we'll be able to measure more of what stereotypes and tropes actually are out there. But there is just such a need for more representation, better representation, and then also more data to be collected on that representation.
Thank you for sharing that. And I mean, speaking of more data, the process is part of the data, right? Like we learn by doing and seeing what works. So, hey, Dr. Nicole, I got a question for you, okay? Because we know, and I know personally, CME is doing a lot of work kind of behind the scenes in relation to the process, right? Like what people are experiencing, how media makes us feel, and how we go about telling these stories. So we've heard a lot about what's going on. Cross-representation of disability to race and all the intersections of that, size and all the intersections of that. Let's talk for a second about what works. Is there a different process that way we can think about that actually helps bring more diverse characters to the screen? Oh, you're muted.
It helps if you unmute yourself. Yeah, I think there's definitely a couple ways and some things that CME has been doing to participate in this process. One, a thing that we haven't really been talking about is the numbers that Dr. Hellman gave us about women behind the scenes or different, right? All that intersectionality of people working in the industry, and having conversations with those folks is so important, right? And how do we help them and support them so that we can advance the next generation of people who are working in media and continue with that advancement that even Jen Newsome was talking about in her opening. And so at CME, we do what we call these Women in Hollywood circles, where we have women coming together from all different intersectionalities, talking about what is the experience of being the only insert your blank in the room, right? And how do you deal with it and how do you advance that? And so really developing strategies and community in that way, I think is a really great way. And there's all different organizations that are doing that, right? And that's awesome. Another one would be, I love that Dr. Nash was talking about the difference between quality and quantity, right? Like it's so great that we have all this data and let's dig into what's actually happening in this advancement. Do more numbers actually equal an advancement in representation? And so all of this, yay, we have these numbers and what are these, what's actually going on in the mix of those numbers advancing? Are these characters actually doing new, better, different things? And so we're working with Amazon and See Change, right? The See Change Institute right now to try to develop these new tools, right? We're talking about how do we do research around this stuff in new ways. And we're working with a group of students called the Amazon Critical Film Scholars to try to really figure out how we can study in that quality area as well. And so we're excited about that, especially working with this group of students, because that is advancing the next generation as well. If we are all thinking about these things and looking into them deeper, and the people who are then going to create are having these conversations at these early stages, we are also hopeful that that will advance representation as well. And then one of the things that I'm most excited about is talking about whiteness. Right? So often we don't talk about whiteness on screen, and that is how white supremacy and patriarchy and all of the isms that we've been talking about, the white cis hetero able-bodied somebody put in there wealthy, right? Like all of the demographics, what are we normalizing on screen? And whiteness is one of the primary ways that we perpetuate white supremacy on screen because we don't acknowledge it as a thing. And so we've been working on developing workshops where we are really working with creators about acknowledging their own whiteness and how do we unpack that, and also white characters on screen and being really attentive and attuned to what white characters are doing, so that you start to think of them as white characters and not just characters, in the same way that we always are acknowledging BIPOC characters as some type of character that's different and othered. Whiteness is also a thing. And so really hoping to get creators to be thinking in that lane as well. So those are some ways of things that we're doing that are different, that are working to advance representation.
Thank you for sharing that. And okay, this has already just been like, if it's new to you, your head is probably exploding right now. Okay, I will go ahead and make space to acknowledge that and presence that. So let's get into this. I want to open the floor to everyone, but I'll kind of go around because I know when we're on Zooms like this, everyone's like, okay, who starts first? Who starts first? So Nash, I'm gonna start with you to start off, and then I'll kind of like go around carousel style with everyone. Let's talk about something. If you could wave a magic wand, let's pretend you have a magic wand, and you could let people, not just media, but people in general, understand something, know something about the groups that you advocate for within your work. What would one of those things be?
That's a good question. I think that I would kind of emphasize that, again, what I said earlier, like quality over quantity, because there has been such a focus on, okay, we're pushing the needle, we're making so much progress, but we really need, and Dr. Haggard also talked about this, we really need to look at the qualitative aspects of the roles that are being represented. Because if we have more representation, but you're just tying more into those stereotypes and tropes, are we really progressing just because we have, you know, increased numbers? So that's something I would say, and that's something I also have been seeing as a pattern with specifically Black women in media and their representation. So really looking at that qualitative analysis is really, really important.
I love that. Can I say something? I love that, you know, at the Gina Davis Institute, where they added colorism and then body size as well. It's like really pushing the needle on what we're able to look at in that quantitative data as well. I think the colorism push is just so great. I hear that with my students all the time. Let's talk about colorism. Let's talk about colorism. And so it's just so exciting to see you guys doing that work. I think it's so important.
And I'll give another shout out in the sense that there is not much data when it comes to disability representation. So, you know, the fact that the Gina Davis Institute includes disability in the TV, the film, the children's studies, you know, is vitally important. And I think specifically from the study that you had mentioned, you know, of Black women in Hollywood, it's important to note that zero women or girls that were Black and disabled were found in this study. And so that is 100% erasure there, and such. And, you know, on the question about what we wish people knew about, you know, disabled folks, you know, we're not defined by our disability. A lot of people want to put us in a bucket and say, okay, you're disabled, that's how we identify you. But just like everyone else, we're multidimensional. You know, we're not focused on overcoming our disability. You know, we don't see our disability as the problem, you know, more it's the challenges that are occurring within the social systems that cause the problem. But like, because of that, we're really innovative. We may not be able to achieve a solution in a typical way, but when we think of different, but we'll think of a different way. For example, when I acquired my disability, I had to learn new ways to push my daughter's stroller or a shopping cart. I was still able to take my daughter for a walk and go shopping, but I just figured out a different way to do that, which really carries over to the entertainment industry, where creativity is so vitally important. And so when you bring on disabled folks onto your team, you're bringing on someone who every day has to think outside the box and come up with new solutions, and, you know, is going to be helpful, not just to a disability story, but everything.
I mean, so you're touching upon not just what happens on screen, but also what happens behind the screen too, right? Within the actual workforce itself. And you would think that Hollywood, being a place that is supposed to thrive on creativity and loves the human saga of things, would actually like to look at the saga beyond just the disability itself as the actual way to create the drama within the story, right?
100%.
Just like you would think that it would be beyond just the color of the skin. There's so many ways to just, Earth is a beautiful, bizarre place, as we have been shown even more so within the past year. There's so many ways to create drama beyond just what's going on with the body, because just being alive on Earth is a lot to deal with, you know. So, I mean, Rebecca, what about for you? If you could wave that magic wand, what's some of the things that you would, touch upon?
There are so many things, but something that comes to mind, which is a little different, is I just think that doing this work, we've learned that there are so many harmful tropes and stereotypes across all identities, but they're kind of hard to spot until you start doing the research. And so I think I would want to wave my wand and put more resources into developing media literacy. And this is something I've learned from Dr. Heldman too, which is this whole conversation about what do we do with the content that exists, like this historical trove of films and TV shows that don't really hold up anymore. And Disney just decided not too long ago that they were going to take a lot of their films off of their platform or put them only on the parent platform. And I think there's such an opportunity to be able to have conversations about that media and develop media literacy and talk about these stereotypes and tropes and identify them together, whether it's parents with children or friends watching shows, because the more I am involved in this research, the more my eyes are opened to how limiting these stereotypes are, especially tropes that at an individual level, they don't seem harmful, right? Like a fat person as a chef, Suki, again, to bring her up, okay, that doesn't seem like it's the most damaging thing in the world. But when you zoom out and see that at an aggregate level, every fat person that shows up, when they show up, are involved with some sort of food, that's just one example. But I think that's where one of the many things I would use with my magic wand would be to have this be more of a conversation while consuming media.
Now, I know, Nicole, you touched on, you got jazzed up with colorism. You were like, oh yeah, because I know we've had these conversations, about colorism. But is there anything else that you can think of that you were like, I wish I could just clip that in people's brains for a second and they would know?
Honestly, a lot along the lines of what Rebecca just said, right? I mean, to me, my students make fun of me because I'm always like, why does this matter, right? How is this impacting you? And I think even for us on an individual level, to be having those conversations where we're talking back to the screen, we're all becoming more aware of these tropes and stereotypes and how are they impacting our real life experience, and how does what appear on screen really show up in the world? And we're really becoming more attuned and having these conversations. So are you having those conversations with yourself and with your people? Right? Are you having them with your kids? Are you having them with your friends? Like if you're sitting around talking about Real Housewives, are you also talking about like, what is it telling you about women, what women care about? And so one of mine would definitely be the Bechdel test. If you don't know what the Bechdel test is, there has to be two women on screen and they have to be having a conversation with each other about something other than a man. And so I always challenge, and spoiler alert, hardly anything passes the Bechdel test because as you've seen, men outnumber women 2-to-1 in the first place. And so I always challenge my students to try to pass the Bechdel test in their real life, right? Like, how are you thinking about when you get together and the conversations that you have, what do you immediately talk about? And so really being aware of what's going on screen and how it's impacting you as a person and to start having those conversations with each other. That's super important to me.
I think that's a great place too for people to start if they're not highly media literate, like Rebecca was referring to. You can go ahead and talk to each other because that like something is bothering you, even if you don't have vocabulary around it, right? And so like talking to other people that are in your groups, your friendships and your interpersonal relationships can really kind of help you illuminate what that thing is and start to even see the pattern of it because someone else is like, oh, that's like something something I saw in this thing, and this is like something that I read in this book. And now you start to see how it's actually ingrained into the stories.
And now you'll see differently, right? I'm sure all of us have had the experience where people hate going to the movies with us because we're always like, did you see that? Did you see that? You know, it's like, can't I just enjoy this movie? Well, yeah, we can enjoy trash if we're going to talk about it though, right? Like, let's have these conversations about what we're consuming and what's going on and how it's impacting us and our cultures. Yeah.
Like, it's fun to watch trash, just know that it's trash. You know, like I knowingly watch trash all the time to decompress, but I go into it recognizing that it's trash, not thinking that I'm getting like, you know, this illumination going into it. And then you just enjoy it for what it is. Like when you eat potato chips, you know, like you know what you're going into with that situation. So I think that's so important. And, you know, we've talked about, people have touched upon this, there's in terms of like, oh, I wish that there were more resources being put into this. And I wish there were more resources being put into that. But I'm going to ask y'all to dream a little bit more again. Like, this is like big dream space time. And now the magic wand is able to go boop and give you unlimited resources. So let's imagine you got unlimited resources. Okay, that means all the money, all the people, all the army that you need. What would you change right now in the industry? Who wants to go first? Just
I know.
Yeah.
I can go first. If that's okay.
Yeah.
I would think, just personally, I think we've talked a lot about, we have media representations in front of the screen, but if I had unlimited resources, I would like to aggregate a database with behind the scenes info as well. I know it's like there's a lot of people and a lot of moving parts, but I think if we could spend more money doing that, that would be kind of a dream for me, because I think it's important to also look at who's writing the stories, who are producing the stories, who's directing. That's also a big part of representation in itself, because if the roles are not there, if they're not written, you're not going to see it, right? So I think that would be my personal dream, is to also look at or put more resources also into looking at behind the scenes data, but also integrating that too with the representation data we have as well.
And I think that goes into hiring, which is super important. And somebody said that too, right? Like, people are always hitting us up, like, who do you know that we could hire to be on this project, right? And people are wanting to be more inclusive in their hiring and wanting that sort of database. But the way that they collect data is so demographic. It doesn't actually speak to your lived life experience, which when you're making movies and TV shows, right? Like, they're like, oh, I need an Asian writer. Well, so really you're just tokenizing an Asian person. Like, no, you actually want somebody who's had a certain type of life experience that can add to your story and run this show that's about this thing, right? So as we're putting those databases together, I would love if we were more mindful about how we so minimize our idea of what diversity is, and that it's a group of people who come together to bring this diverse perspective, and not that a person is going to bring you diversity. And so how are we thinking of all of us as diverse individuals that have this incredible life experience that lets us bring diversity to a new group of people? So yeah, like expanding what we're thinking of when we're putting databases of people to hire as well would be one for me.
I would also add, like, came to mind, but like inclusion. So making sure when people are there that they feel included is big, because again, with numbers, you just tokenize someone and then they feel completely alone and unsupported in their workplace.
Yeah,
I think that's a big challenge too with hiring. So it really, you know, we want people to have accessibility. We want people to feel included. I think that's also really important as well.
That's what we really focused on in our Hollywood White Supremacy and Me workshops, was like, how are you showing up in the spaces that's actually limiting inclusivity? Yeah. Sorry, Lauren, you were about to.
That's okay. I was enjoying listening, but so many disabled writers specifically don't have representation, and so people joke that I become their kind of de facto manager. I'd probably make a whole lot more money if I left the nonprofit world and became a manager. But, you know, in making those connections, because another part of what we do is do a lot of consulting work. And so I am super excited for what we're going to see in like 2023. And so, because we all know that content takes forever. But one thing that I always like to say is that consultants are great, but writers are better. And that what I'm trying trying to do is get writers into the rooms, not be the only one. Because we all know that like someone is brought in exactly what you said, Nicole, of being completely tokenized. But when we're able to help place a writer in the room, where we stay on as consultants as well. So even if there may only be one disabled person in the room, they know that they're being supported by people from outside as well, which I think is really important. And so they're not expected to represent the 61 million people in America who have a disability, you know. And I think that part of this, like, it doesn't even necessarily need unlimited resources. You know, we just need to kind of reduce the stigma around having a disability about what we can do and can't do. So we just, I see it in the multiple people in the chat, just hire people, you know, give people the opportunity and the chance to tell our own stories, as well as tell stories that have nothing to do with disability. You know, like just because you're of one race or one gender doesn't mean you can't be part of helping to tell other stories as well. Or the fact that we all have so many parts of us, you know, and yes, I could write about disability, but I could also write about being a mom. By the way, the disabled mom is like something that doesn't exist anywhere. And so if we're talking about things, but I think when we can have this decision-making power, that's going to really make a huge, huge difference. But the one thing that I would also love to do is more trainings. And I think that is, you know, it's something that we've started to do. We have partnerships with many of the studios. And when we are brought in to do a training, it you know, people, like, their eyes are opened of like, huh, I didn't even, it's not an issue, in my opinion, that people are intentionally excluding disabled folks. It's just that they don't even think that, they don't even realize that we exist in one sense, even though 1 in 4 adults in America have a disability. And so of just getting at that table where we're not just sitting at the table, but leading that table, where people can then listen and be like, oh, wow. So my job is to bring in new and innovative stories. There's this huge population of people, you know, that have new innovative stories when we're talking about any of these populations that we've mentioned today, which I think could make a huge, huge difference. And I love what you said before about more data and tracking, because that is something that just doesn't exist for people with disabilities, especially behind the camera. Like, there's no data on directors, disabled directors, you know, and all of that. So I'm just super excited, because I feel like everything everyone is saying kind of applies to all the work that we're doing. And it's just really great to be here with all of you.
What about you, Rebecca?
Well, I want to shout out one thing from the chat, which was not my idea, but to see it, I think it was Diane who said pay equity. Yes, I would want to start off by paying everybody the same and what they're worth, and making sure that it is that there is equitable pay structures within the behind the scenes industry. But the other thing I think is important, and this is again repeating what everybody is saying, but more accessibility to education around filmmaking, and having the people who have diverse stories to tell have access to programs that teach filmmaking and editing and directing and producing. And just to shout out the Representation Project, you know, we have our Youth Media Academy, which does just that, run by the amazing Annie Delgado. And I would like to see more young people having access to the industry in that way.
Thank you for that. Well, this has been absolutely amazing. And we have a little bit of time left before everybody, you know, that goes their separate ways for the hour. And the Q&A has been blowing up. So I want to ask the question to everybody that came up, which is, what is your favorite book that talks about gender gaps in media?
One of mine that's kind of a fun one to read is Backwards and in Heels by Alicia Milano, who is on the Turner Classic Movie Channel. And it kind of gives the history of women in Hollywood, and also different movements that are happening. So it's a really fun one too, right? To get this sort of like stories and history of your brain going. So I'll throw that one in the mix.
Love that. And then, hey, Caroline.
Hello, I'm just here for data questions. Don't mind me.
Yeah, we got them. It's like, so there was a question about some of the numbers that you presented. They were basically asking, like, you know, are these numbers for TV in general, or can we access the data for children's television?
Yes, the best one-stop shop for kids content is going to be the Gina Davis Institute. So the Annenberg Initiative does overall, mostly film, not exclusively, but mostly film. Gina Davis Institute, their lane is focusing on family content. And then Martha Lausen at the Center for the Study of Women in Television and Film focuses, she provides the television component beyond the film component, but it's overall. So for kids content, Gina Davis Institute.
So then we had a couple of other ones. You want me to keep going? This was about the film. So like, are your stats based on one-off films only? Or, and are there stats that include characters in streaming series?
Yeah, so it does include, so if it's television, it does include streaming content for most of those years, although, I mean, we think of streaming as normal now, but a lot of this content, we weren't on streaming services 10 years ago, by and large. So it shifted over time, but the more contemporary data does include that. Most of the TV data is coming from the diversity report out of UCLA and Dr. Darnell Hunt.
I love it. So now this is the kind of question I want to throw out to everyone, especially with you here, Caroline. Like, what tools can we use to become more in tune with our own internal biases?
Dr. Nicole Haggard, would you like to talk about some of the implicit and explicit bias tools that CME has developed to address this?
Tools, I mean, our workshop for sure is one that I think is great. I think I would love for there to be like a media literacy journal, right? Where you're just like talking back to yourself about what you're reading that also has prompts. Yeah.
We need to create that.
Yeah, I think that needs to exist.
Put that together.
Yeah.
Next project, right? And the REP project we do media analysis similar to CME and some other organizations where we can analyze content. So looking at the quantity of representation and the quality of representation from script reading to, stats analysis of, content, whether it's a batch or a single piece of content. So there are a lot of folks in the space doing this work. So that's really helpful for industry folks. On an individual level, the implicit bias tests out of Harvard are really great ways to measure your implicit bias toward various things that you may have no idea. You might think of yourself as being very thoughtful and committed to various groups that you don't belong to or marginalized groups. And then you take the implicit bias test and you find that you have some bias.
And I think where you find that line up, especially if any of that data that Dr. Hellman presented surprised you, right? Now start watching those types of shows and that type of content so that you can interact with that, and wherever your bias matches up on the Harvard test, and watch content in that area and see what it's creating for you. I think that would be really an interesting way to do it too.
And Alicia had a question about how the data is measured around people with disabilities. So she was basically wondering, like, does the character and or the storyline have to acknowledge the disability for that character's representation to count toward that disability representation? Or can it just, can the character just be existing on screen with the disability?
So I added the disability measure when I was at the Gina Davis Institute. I can speak to how we operationalize it. We're not the only people in the space who have done that work. There are a few other studies, but so however it manifests, right? So we focus on 4 different types of disability: physical, cognitive, communication, and more recently mental health, because NAMI and other organizations have now started to classify mental health issues, some mental health issues, as disabilities. And so however it comes up, it doesn't require that the character self-identify. There might be other cues in content that would identify a character as being disabled. But Lauren, and maybe you want to speak to this as well.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that mental health is 100% considered a disability. So there's the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990, and according to that, mental health, assuming that it affects some aspect of your day-to-day living, is classified and means that you are legally protected in the United States in terms of the disability classification. And so, and I know that GLAAD, for example, like their study, which takes a look at primetime TV, is a lot of self-reported data from the studios. And I can tell you over the past few years, I've called up my contacts at the studios and said, hey, you're underreporting. What about this character? What about that character? Because to your point about mental health, sometimes people don't realize that non-visible disabilities are disabilities. Learning disabilities, dyslexia, mental health, things like ADHD, all are classified as a disability. And so sometimes you can visibly see it. And sometimes it is, you're right, in the, you know, in the conversation where, you know, a child is talking about having dyslexia, for example, which is the most prevalent disability for school-age children. And I think that's why disability is not as included in many studies, because it's a lot harder to track, you know, because you can't be going on by just what you see. In most cases, you can't go by what you see, and really have to be looking at so many other cues.
Well, this was amazing. I mean, this was our time. It's Caroline.
I could bring Christine and Monica back, our co-sponsors for this event. Thank you everyone for putting your ideas in the chat. We will be incorporating those in the State of Media report that you'll receive next week. You'll receive the slide deck shortly, and I'll pass it off to Monica first for some closing words, and then Christine.
Yes, just wanted to say thank you to everyone. This was very informative, and especially at CME, where we think a lot about intersectionality, hearing from all of these different perspectives was wonderful.
Yeah, I know I wasn't supposed to take notes, Caroline, but I couldn't help myself, so I was really busy. This was such a fascinating conversation, not just for your incredible insights, but for the ways in which you all are modeling the kind of interrogation tactics that we need to apply to our work. At the Provincetown Film Society, for instance, where we showcase films and provide programs for underserved filmmakers, your work inspires me, and it's instructive as I interrogate in I'm designing and executing our programs. You made me think about, and this is a conversation we're having, about such things as, you know, where we're programming certain films. It's one thing to invite diverse filmmakers and diverse voices, but where are we programming those films? Where are we housing the filmmakers? Are we providing them with stipends to come to the festival? Are we providing accessibility? So you have given me so much to think about, and I think everyone on this call is going to be edified, and they're going to do their work differently. So I want to thank you so much, and I want to remind everybody on this call that look for you to look for an email in a week or so. We'll send the deck and that Dr. Hildman presented earlier, and all of the information from the chat, and maybe other recommendations that this group has as a follow-up to this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. We'll see you next year. Bye.
Bye.